First of all, in terms of the original, vision of BRICS, and yes, absolutely, I was working very closely with Jim at the time, and we even put out something which I think is probably the corniest title I've ever used for one of my publications, which was called the Bricklayer, which tried to sort of bring some of the ideas we had around just how fast demand for consumer products in particular would pick up in the BRICS. And I just remember, when we first started to do that work, and we were looking for growth in sort of mobile phone penetration of 40% and, within a year or two, and people just thought those numbers were ridiculous. But of course, one of the things that very clearly played out in the BRICS economies and elsewhere was the importance of thinking about demand for things like consumer durables and so on, not with a GDP mindset where, GDP might go up, whether it's 5% or 10%, and so would demand for a product. That's not the right way to think about how these economies were changing, because demand for many key products, consumer durables, and hence some of the component inputs, grow much more, as an S-curve. In other words, if you're on a dollar a day and you double your income, you don't necessarily buy a lot more washing machines, and similarly, if you're earning $1 million a year and you double your income, maybe you don't buy that many more. There's a sweet spot, and our view was then that China was right on the cusp of that, and India was about 10 to 15 years behind. And I think in general that's sort of played out. Great, now you've got my presentation up. Let me go through a couple of the kind of key, more quantitative points I wanted to emphasize. I'll try and be relatively brief so we've got more time for Q&A. But one thing I think is very important is back when we first started to talk about BRICS, right on the left-hand side of this chart, the contribution to global growth, in this case from China specifically, was only about 30 basis points. And so really what I want you to take away from this chart is, putting aside 2020, of course, and the COVID situation, is that even as the GDP growth rate in China has fallen dramatically from a peak of 14% with the sort of stimulus in 07, down to more like 6%, the contribution to global growth from China has actually gone up. And so for many things that we care about, demand for certain commodities, for the importance of China, for the impact on other emerging markets around China, it's ever more important, even though the growth rate has obviously come down very, very significantly. And I think as this has played out, it's completely changed the nature of geopolitics as well. So more countries today have China as their main trading partner than the US, and that's a big shift. And so we would expect that to continue. Growth rate coming down, but the contribution of China to global growth remaining extremely important and just as high as before. If we go to page 2, this is very obvious stuff on page 2. But clearly, as all of this has played out, you've seen this shift very strongly towards investment. Are we able to go to page 2? Well, fortunately, it is a very, there we go, terrific. So investment, of course, has grown much faster than GDP, and along with that has come a decrease in the efficiency of investment. So we're measuring that here simply by the ICOR, or incremental capital output ratio. And so you can see that, which is inverted on the right-hand side, that quite significant deterioration. Now, for a country with a very high savings rate, this doesn't create in itself a systemic risk for China, in my view, but it does have an impact on trend growth, and that's incorporated in those numbers you're seeing before. Now, if we look on page 3, I think we have to address the debt issue in China. Everyone is always very obsessed about the risks from the high level of leverage in China. I've been much more relaxed about that structurally, but we have, of course, seen a sharp jump after some years of stabilization with the response to COVID. That's true absolutely everywhere, and I think actually in China, these moves are relatively manageable and do not in themselves create a systemic risk. But how this plays out as we look on page 4 is going to be quite important. And we are seeing, I think, quite a meaningful shift at the moment. On page 4, if that can come up, what you're seeing is an adjustment in terms of where the sort of the pain is on the debt side and the default side. So until very recently, first of all, of course, there are very few defaults. That's a defining characteristic, but almost all of them were private enterprises. Whereas you're seeing a little bit of a shift towards SOE defaults, which you can see in the blue bars on the left. And so that's something that is actually a good thing, but it's something that we'll be watching quite closely just to make sure that that plays out in a smooth fashion. That would certainly be our expectation. But given what's happening with monetary policy, which I'll come back to, that will be quite an important aspect of how China manages this transition. In fact, maybe just to sort of touch on the monetary policy side of it here. Just in the most recent statements that we've had from policymakers in China, there's just a little bit of a hint towards a tightening of policy. They're focused now a little bit more on avoiding sort of building in systemic risks into the financial system, and also on kind of creating room for future monetary policy easing should that be necessary. And that just sort of sends a little bit of a signal that policy might be a touch tighter going forward. And the GDP growth targets look very low to us. Policymakers are talking about 6%. We would see Chinese growth in 2021 more like 8%, even if they do very little on the policy side. Now, on page 5, obviously the share of household income as a percentage of GDP has gone down, and the share of consumption remains very low in China today. But that said, you have had, as you can see in the orange bars on the left, you've had very significant compounded growth in consumption. It's just been a little bit less dramatic than the rest of the economy. And the point I would make here, and this is something I think we all need to watch carefully going forward in China, is that in the past, it was always easy to say, well, the household sector has so much room to grow, there's so little leverage. If anything goes wrong, we can just lever up the consumer. That's no longer the case. Mortgage debt and some other consumer debt has risen relatively significantly now in China. And so that room that was always there before is much less true now. On page 6, on the left-hand side, you can see the aging of the population. We all know this, I won't go through that, but clearly China is aging significantly. But then when you look at the education level for workers, I think here there's quite an interesting opportunity. This is a space that for example, we at Temasek are very focused on to invest in education sector in China, both in terms of primary, secondary education, but also sort of tertiary qualifications, retraining, and so on. There's a lot of opportunity there to continue China's build up the sort of value-added curve that we've already seen significantly. On page 7, just briefly on in terms of these SOE reforms and the sort of tighter sort of budget for SOEs. Of course, that's going to lead to an exit of non-viable firms. I won't take you through all of this given the time, but what I would focus on is right at the bottom, the kind of fiscal reforms that are going to be necessary to manage this process. There's going to need to be a greater flow of fiscal resources to some of the poorer regions, and also a shift in the nature of local government revenues towards more sustainable revenue, like property taxes, rather than very, very cyclical things like property sales, for example. So again, that's something that we believe is happening that will make the China story more sustainable and continue this quite extraordinary rise that we've seen in China. Given the time, I'll just be very, very brief on the other bricks. So on page 8, we can see obviously since the original work, we've had very, very strong but slowing growth in India, Russia, and Brazil. On page 9, a key point I would make here is that obviously the savings rate in these other BRICS, that creates a much greater limit to the investment growth that we can expect. And particularly as the earlier commodity super cycle unwound, that limited the growth potential and also led to some currency weakness. Given the time, let me just jump to slide 12, because one good thing for actually many emerging markets, but including Brazil, India, and Russia, is that in the past, we always worried that whenever there's a bit of a risk-off event, currencies will depreciate. The pass-through from depreciation to inflation is very high. And so, central banks would be forced into a pro-cyclical tightening of monetary policy, which would be very, very difficult. That's much less true. First of all, inflation rates everywhere are low, although obviously some and others would argue that there are some risks there, but we would expect that to continue for the foreseeable future. And pass-through from depreciation has fallen pretty much everywhere. And that gives monetary policy much greater flexibility in all of these markets, and also allows the countries to use the exchange rates much more as a shock absorber, which is exactly what you want them to be able to do. And that makes, again, the sort of growth story a little more sustainable. So finally, on the last page, the external imbalances and reserve adequacy numbers have improved. That's especially true for Russia, but for many of these markets. And so overall, as we look at all of these countries, we're still very positive structurally on the BRICS. I'd say in terms of our shorter term views, I'd make a little bit of a distinction right now and say, China has had a fantastic run. Policy, it dealt with the COVID situation arguably much faster. And also had very accommodating policy settings. Those settings are now just starting to be tightened a little bit, and markets have run up. So we would be a little less excited right now, but the structural story in China is still fantastic, whereas the other emerging markets, we would still retain a tactical sort of positive on. But just one last point to close on in terms of really the big picture, longer term sort of outlook for, in particular, China. I think there's still a tendency among many people in the West to sort of think of China as being a brilliant copycat producer, and that is just absolutely not the case in so many areas. And I don't just mean in sort of producing goods, but in terms of life sciences, for example. There really is some amazing innovation going on in China, and that's a space that we love, and I think is testament to the shift in the nature of the growth story in China, very much moving up the value-added curve. So let me leave it there, and we can cover more stuff in the Q&A. Thank you.